Bonjour.
Bonjour.
James Reese, one of the most important and overlooked figures of the 20th century. Composer, arranger, band leader, innovator, war hero, organizer, advocate for the cause of equality of African Americans, not only in music, but in society as a whole. His list of accomplishments is more than impressive. He founded the Clef Club in 1910 to address issues and needs particular to the African American musician. He was the first African American to record for a major record label. His musical accompaniment gave rise to the development of popular dance forms such as foxtrot. He was the most recognized member of the famed 369th Infantry Regiment, also known as the Harlem Hellfighters. He was credited with being the first to introduce to France music filled with elements of what became known as jazz. Historical literature seems to have given Europe less credit than he deserves of his contributions to the development of black music. Other early 20th century notables such as Ford Dabney, U.B. Blake, and Noble Sissel have been greater in prominence in the historical record. Many historians of African American history have regarded Europe's promoting a positive African American agenda as suspect, perhaps because Europe often voiced opinions which echoed Booker T. Washington's call for accommodation. However, given what is known of Reese's activities to African American interests and other ways such as his efforts to promote African American concert music, being a major player in the creation of the Harlem Settlement Music Association, and founding the Tempo and Clef Clubs, he very well may have considered himself as one of Du Bois' talented tenth. In his biography, Life in Ragtime by Reed Badger, it's noted he could consciously strove to improve race relations by embodying the principles that both Du Bois and Washington had called for in African American leaders. Reese felt strongly about the importance of black people creating black music and not imitating white musicians and composers. In The Music of Black Americans by Eileen Southern, he's quoted as saying, "I am firmly convinced more than ever that Negroes should write Negro music. We have our own racial feelings, and if we try to copy whites, we will make bad copies. If we are able to develop in America, we must develop along our own lines." On New Year's Day, 1918, 1 year before the first Pan-African Congress took place here in Paris, hundreds of American soldiers landed in France. Many African American soldiers were in that number. Their job was to unload cargo and do menial tasks. By law, the black soldiers were not allowed to fight alongside white soldiers. Among that group of black soldiers was 60 men of the military band from the 15th Infantry Regiment, who were led by then Lieutenant James Reese. Those soldiers eventually were allowed to go into battle. They were renamed the 369th Regiment. That particular regiment was given the name the Hellfighters because of their ferocious fighting style. They went on to serve with such distinction that they all won France's highest award for bravery. Those same soldiers were also some of the finest musicians out of Harlem. When they stepped off that boat, January 1, 1918, history was made as the 369th Military Band played the French national anthem in a jazz-tinged arrangement, thereby introducing a new style of music to France. I'm going to ask if our musical director and arranger, please meet Mr. Jamal Crowder. At the end of the war, the 369th sailed home as heroes. After returning from the war, Europe spent a lot of time in the recording studio working with his internationally acclaimed orchestra, cranking out the hits. His recordings were among some of the most popular songs recorded at this time. One such song was a song written by an African-American songwriter from Chicago, Shelton Brooks, in 1915. It was a slice of life. It was talking about what was going on at that time and in the environment, particularly in the cities on the south side of Chicago. On the south side of Chicago now, there's an area called Bronzeville. During this particular time, it was known, they called it Dark Town. That was a term that could be used by African Americans, but not by those outside of the community. Also, in terms of dance, the folks in the hood were strutting. Today, it may be called swag. This particular song has been recorded by many artists, but interestingly enough, one of his biggest selling recordings was done by James Reese and his orchestra. The song is entitled "The Dark Town Strutters Ball."
I'll be down to get you in a taxi, I need. Better be ready by 6:30. I mean, don't all over my soul when the band plays just for me. Said the morning I never learned to I'll be down to get you in a pushcart, honey. Better be ready by 8:30. Honey, don't be late. Be there when the band starts playing. Remember when you get there, honey. Shim, sham, win some more. Dance all on my shoes. When the band plays the jazz blues. Sail on night and stop to fall.
Editorial that ran in the May 1919 edition of The Crisis, W.E.B. Bois wrote, "We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting." It was Du Bois' hope that the valiant service of the African American men towards the war effort abroad would be rewarded with civil rights benefits at home. The hope that white Americans would change its ways and would start treating black people equally. But that did not happen. What did happen was the Red Summer of 1919. The Red Summer of 1919 was a series of race riots by whites attacking African American families in their homes and their communities. One theory for the violence was many whites felt that although the African American soldiers had been treated fairly and with dignity in France, they, the whites, were going to change nothing in their treatment of blacks here in America after the war. One of the most popular songs of that post-World War I era was a song entitled How are you going to keep them down on the farm once they've seen everything? A big hit record recorded by James Reese's orchestra. For many Americans, the song was a double entendre. For whites, particularly those in the rural South, the song echoed their sentiments about the sons, fathers, and brothers returning home from the war. Although they were in battle, they were exposed to a different culture of music, food, astrology. And after experiencing that, making the transition back to the lifestyle they left would be difficult. For African Americans, it was a bit of a rhetorical question, maybe a proclamation. I'm not coming home to be mistreated after having fought for freedom abroad, not to return to have freedom denied. The title of the song, again, how are you going to keep them down on the farm once they've seen everything? James Reese Europe left an indelible mark on the music world of his day and on the music to come. The students here from Chicago West Community Music Center After School Matters program are a testament to his legacy. The struggle continues. Thank you.